Cian Corla, the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union is a bad decision for the UK. It's a bad decision for Ireland, and it's a bad decision for the European Union. It's a symptom of the growing disconnect between politics and the citizens politics is meant to serve. A symptom of the growing sense of the haves and the have-nots. A symptom of some of the failures of globalisation, including a world in which 65 people now own over half the global wealth. Ireland must act quickly, and we must act decisively to protect Ireland's interests and also to support the interests of our neighbours in the UK. We also, Cian Corla, have got to reflect on this result and seek to understand what lessons can be learnt for Ireland and for the European Union. The decision to leave the EU will almost certainly damage the United Kingdom. Treasury have forecast that UK GDP could fall by 6% in the coming years. New regulations and barriers to trade are likely to affect capital flows and international trades in goods and services to and from the UK. Labour productivity could also be held back by a decrease in foreign direct investment and a smaller pool of skills as immigration flows are likely to reduce. Thursday's vote also makes the United Kingdom more fragile, where we see England and Wales voting to leave the EU, but Scotland and Northern Ireland voting to remain in the EU. Here in Ireland, we must focus immediately on those groups most affected by Brexit. That includes the 400,000 Irish citizens living in the UK. It includes the 115,000 UK citizens living here in the Republic. It includes the people of Northern Ireland who will be wondering what this holds. And it includes Irish firms trading with the UK. Cian Corla, 400,000 people, Irish-born nationals, live in the UK. That's more than the populations of Limerick, Cork, Galway and Waterford cities combined. These people, and over 100,000 UK nationals living here in the Republic, are living with uncertainty. They are looking at the prospect of tighter border controls, potentially restrictions in movement, and indeed uncertainty about access to things like social protection and public services, which were key themes in the UK during this vote. I would suggest to the Minister that we need to move very, very quickly to put bilateral agreements in place ahead of EU agreements with the UK, bilateral agreements in place with the UK to absolutely guarantee the rights and the placement not just of Irish citizens in the UK, but indeed of the UK citizens here. The economic impacts in Ireland could be quite severe. Hopefully they won't be. But it's very interesting, Minister, that the FTSE fell by nearly 4% on Friday. The Irish Stock Exchange fell by twice that amount. And the Isaac Financial actually fell by 20% in just one day. So the markets have factored in twice as much damage to the Irish stock market as they have to the UK stock market, something we need to be very, very cognizant of. We know that about €1 billion in goods and services is traded with the UK every week. We know that 15% of all of our exports go to the UK, 20% of all of our services go to the UK, 40% of all of our food exports go to the UK. Now, the ESRI has estimated that Brexit could cause a fall in trade of a fifth, which would have devastating impacts, obviously, on the food industry and on other industries who have very close economic ties with the UK. There are very serious questions to be resolved over Northern Ireland. We must work to make sure that no new barriers are put in place, and indeed to seize whatever opportunities Brexit might produce. We are looking at the very real possibility of a new hard border being put in place, which obviously would be a retrograde step. And of course, any disruption to cross-border economic activity could have a very serious effect on the economy of Northern Ireland and on the border regions here in the south. The EU also faces, I would argue, a crisis of identity. The EU was meant to be built on solidarity. The Union has the stated purpose of, quote, reflecting the will of the citizens and the states of Europe to build a common future. After Brexit, we're now seeing calls in France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Greece, Sweden and other EU countries to hold similar exit referendums. Now, those calling for such votes obviously feel that the EU isn't acting in their interests and doesn't reflect their will. But as we saw during the banking crisis, the EU seems to have been captured, to a greater or lesser extent, by some very serious special interests. The interests of international bondholders, for example, were put above the interests of the Irish citizens. We found out through the banking inquiry that Jean-Claude Trichet, when president of the ECB, directly and explicitly threatened Ireland in a very, very serious way. He threatened that if private sector losses were imposed on private sector speculators, that he would pull liquidity assistance out of our banks, and in so doing so collapse our banking system, and in so doing so collapse our economy. That's the ECB, which is meant to be the monetary body working for the common good of Europe. It certainly hasn't been working that way for Ireland. The EU also appears to be increasingly run by a small number of countries. We saw the so-called founding members of the EU come together over the weekend to push for a quick EU exit. The Minister might be able to clarify to the House if the Taoiseach was invited to this meeting. We saw Angela Merkel meet with Donald Tusk, François Hollande and Matteo Renzi in Berlin today. It would be very useful to know if the Taoiseach was invited to that meeting. It is absolutely critical that Ireland plays a leading role. We are a small country, but in this negotiation, we must make our voice heard. And if we're not even being invited to these set pieces by the so-called Central European states, we're off to a very bad start. So I'd like to know, was the Taoiseach invited to any of these meetings? And if not, is every diplomatic effort being made to make it very clear to these countries that it is totally unacceptable that they would meet and they would start acting in this way without the broader EU membership? I would argue that we need to stand very firmly with the UK during their exit negotiations. The European leaders have been lining up over the last few days to make an example of the UK. They're going to make it as painful as possible for the UK, just like they did to Ireland. When they saw what happened in Ireland, they said, we don't want anyone else acting like this, so we're going to hang this small country out to dry. And that's exactly what they did. And it is exactly what they are lining up to do to the UK. Straight after the Brexit result was announced, we saw a joint statement from Juncker, Tusk, Martin Schulz and the Dutch Prime Minister calling on the UK to leave, quote, as soon as possible, however painful this may be. The implication there is however painful for the UK, obviously, this may be. As Jean-Claude Juncker has since said that the departure will not be, quote, an amicable divorce. Now, on the basis that there isn't essentially a Prime Minister in Britain at the moment, what he's clearly talking about is the position that the EU intends taking in its negotiations. So after a 44-year membership of the UK, Ceann Comhairle, the UK is being asked to trigger Article 50 as soon as possible. Now, the UK is going to need allies during those negotiations, and we should be one of those allies. Ireland's special relationship with the UK must be maintained, and indeed, this is an opportunity to strengthen it. We have a special relationship with the UK that predates the EU. And we need to immediately and firmly establish that Ireland will have its own deals with the UK if necessary. It is critical that we establish the primacy of that point over group deals done between the UK and the EU. The EU will be looking to lock the UK out. It will be looking to damage its society. It will be looking to damage its economy to make sure that nobody else thinks about leaving. So that if the Swedes or the French or the Danes or the Greeks or anyone else decides to have a referendum, that the EU will point at Britain and say, look, they can no longer move freely, they can no longer trade freely, they can no longer invest freely, so if you leave, the same is going to happen to you. It is critical that if the EU does impose those types of deals with the UK, that we have different deals in place, that we do not accept a principle that says the same trade negotiations apply for all of the EU 27 that will apply to the UK. We must have primacy of our own deals. There are, of course, potential opportunities which the government has referenced. FDI, you would have to think, is set to increase. Commercial activity from the UK looks likely to come over in financial services and in other goods and services sectors. Also, if we can get our trade agreements, free movement of labour, of people, of capital between Ireland and the UK, if we can get them right, and they can be tighter than a general EU deal, we may actually be able to benefit and tighten our relationships with the UK, because relative to other EU countries, we would have freer movement better relationships. So it could in fact be an opportunity. We are likely to see the movement of skilled migrants as well to Ireland. There's a tech conference on at the moment looking for high-skilled people in the tech industry and the ICT industry. It is likely that we're going to see a flow of high-skilled migrants to Ireland, something that we should look forward to. The people of Northern Ireland, critically, some of them already are, as we know, may begin to look towards the EU and away from London. If that is the case, which appears to be the case, we must be positioned as part of the EU to use that opportunity to strengthen our relationships socially, culturally, economically with Northern Ireland and pursue opportunities as they arise for closer integration. The UK vote is a symptom of the disconnect between the European Union and its citizens. We've seen this. A recent survey by the Commission found that 20% of EU citizens have a, quote, totally negative view of the UK, a function of the EU's dysfunction and, I would argue, exclusivity. We have felt the impact of this, and the people of the UK, I think, are about to feel it, to see it as well. But it fits. The UK vote fits with a global trend. We are seeing Donald Trump gaining support on the promise of building walls and keeping Muslims out of the US. We're seeing the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece. We're seeing the rise of the National Front in France, the True Finn Party. We're seeing the rise of ultranationalism in Europe. We're seeing the rise of an equivalent in the US with Donald Trump in the presidential elections. Europe's response to the refugee crisis has seen many of those escaping war being described as economic refugees, which obviously is outrageous. So there is a global trend here which needs to be pushed back. It needs to be taken very seriously. Social democracy is a part of that. Social democracy which is pro-enterprise, which is pro-trade, but critically is absolutely focused on equality and everyone sharing the benefits of economic growth and wealth creation.
Thank you. Deputy Eamon Ryan, 8 minutes.
Can Corla